In the last video, I introduced the Dred Scott decision, and I said we would get into the details now, and here we go. Dred Scott was a slave. Excuse me. He was owned by a gentleman in the Army, and this gentleman in the Army brought him to non-slavery states to live. One was Illinois. And so Dred Scott said, well, how can I be a slave? How can I be bound to this man if I live in a place where slavery is not allowed? So thus, because he brought me here as his property, I still have the right to be set free because slavery is not allowed here. I can't be in a condition that's illegal in this place. And so that was his argument to the Supreme Court. And he said, because I live in these free areas, I am legally free. It just is, for him it made perfect sense. So the court hears Dred Scott's argument, and they go to chambers and they review the case, and the court decides, Scott, they come back with the decision he is not a free man. And they give two arguments or reasons for their decision. The first is that Scott had no right to sue for his freedom because he wasn't a legal citizen. You see, slaves did not have citizen rights. So even though they lived in a free state, his position as a slave said, you don't have any right to sue because you're not a citizen. Only citizens have those kind of rights. So even to sue, whatever your argument is, you can't even bring it to the court because you don't have the right to do that because you're not a citizen. And then he was kind of put on the same level. The court interpreted slavery as slaves are property. So whether you live in a free state or slave state, you would always be a slave. And maybe a way to help you understand this is if Dred Scott, when they moved to Illinois, they not only brought him, but they brought some furniture. They brought their kitchen table and their chairs. Well, the kitchen table and chairs will always be his master's property, whether they live in a slave state or they live in a free state, because his property is his property. It's not going to change based on whether the state is free or not. And so the Supreme Court really categorized Dred Scott not as a human being, but they really put him on the level of simply being property, like a chair or a table that you would move. There is no question whether your property stops being your table stops being your table if you live in a free state or a slave state. It's your table. And the court said it is no different with slaves, actually human beings. They are simply property. They may be human, but they're property. And your property is your property. It'll be your property in a slave state. It'll be your property in a free state. Like your shoes. Either state you're in, they're your shoes. They're your property. So the North, including Abraham Lincoln, hated this ruling. Just hated it because, and please understand, with Lincoln, he was against slavery. But the thing that was more important to Abraham Lincoln was keeping the country united. And with decisions like this, and bleeding Kansas, and popular sovereignty, Lincoln was seeing that the country, the union of the states to be the one country, the United States of America, could be falling apart. And so the North hated the ruling, the South loved the ruling. And Lincoln decides, after a couple failed bids on being elected to the Congress, he joins this new party called the Republican Party. And they nominate him, this man who hasn't had a lot of success with politics, to run for the President of the United States. So, the South says, we know Lincoln hates slavery. If he becomes president, he will totally destroy our right to have slaves. We will lose this. So the South says Lincoln gets elected. If he becomes our president, he hates slavery. We will secede. We will leave. In a sense, we will divorce. We will get out. We will no longer agree to be a part of this union. We're getting out. And so Lincoln runs for president. There were 3 people who ran for president. Stephen Douglas was probably the one who would be his greatest competitor, you would say. And so this is what Lincoln ran on. He opposed Kansas-Nebraska Act, the idea of in these new territories that the people could decide. Lincoln was totally against slavery being spread. He didn't want to get rid of slavery. The country he didn't think could handle it, but he wanted to make sure it didn't spread. The Southerners hated that. And so the Southerners see Lincoln as an abolitionist, that he wants to totally get rid of slavery, and they will lose all rights to their property and their rights as a citizen to have their property. Stephen Douglas, he ran on a platform of popular sovereignty. We need to let every section of the country begin to decide whether they want slavery or not. And so just from these 2 positions and platforms, you can see that the South would be much more for Douglas, even though Douglas was from Illinois, and much more opposed to Lincoln. But Lincoln is elected. In South Carolina, the moment he's elected, secedes from the Union. South Carolina makes a declaration, we are no longer a part of the United States of America. We are leaving. And from that declaration, from that moment on, the war begins. Because Lincoln immediately sends troops down to Fort Sumter outside of Charleston in South Carolina to bring the state back to the Union, that this state is a part of the United States, and the war begins. In the next video, we will look at where North Carolina was in all this.